Columbus didn't discover America by accident. He was trying to find pepper, not metaphorically, not as a side effect of some grander ambition. The explicit, documented, contractually stated goal of the 1492 voyage was to reach the spice-producing regions of Asia by sailing west, because the eastern routes had been cut off, and Europe was running out of options. That single fact, that the Western Hemisphere entered recorded history as a navigational error made by a man desperately searching for a seasoning, tells you almost everything you need to know about what spices actually were. They were not a luxury, they were a strategic resource, a pharmaceutical currency, a weapon of economic warfare so powerful that controlling the supply of black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves gave you leverage over every government in Europe, and almost none of that makes it into the textbooks. To understand why spices drove nations to the edge of bankruptcy and the edge of known maps, you have to start with what they actually did. In a world without refrigeration, without antibiotics, without any reliable way to keep food from spoiling or infection from spreading, spices were one of the closest things to a solution that existed. Pepper slowed bacterial growth in preserved meat. Cinnamon had documented antimicrobial properties. Cloves numbed pain, masked the smell of decay, and were used by medieval physicians as an anesthetic during tooth extractions. Nutmeg, in small quantities, was a sedative. In large quantities, it caused hallucinations vivid enough that it was sometimes used as a substitute for more expensive drugs. These were not ingredients. They were medicine, preservative, and intoxicant, all packed into small dried plants that could be transported thousands of miles without spoiling. The Romans understood this. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the spice trade between India and the Mediterranean had become one of the most lucrative commercial networks in the ancient world. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder complained bitterly that Rome was hemorrhaging gold to pay for Indian pepper and aromatics, an estimated 50 million sesterces a year flowing east, draining the empire's treasury in exchange for small dried seeds and bark. Pliny called it a catastrophe. The merchants who supplied those seeds called it a business model. The geography of spices is the first thing that explains why they were so expensive. The plants that produced the most valuable spices, black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, grew in a remarkably small number of places. Black pepper came almost exclusively from the Malabar coast of southwestern India, the region we now call Kerala. Cloves and nutmeg grew only on a handful of tiny islands in what is now eastern Indonesia, a cluster of specks in the Pacific that European cartographers hadn't even mapped yet. These places were not close to Europe. They were not easy to reach, and the people who controlled the territory between them and European buyers knew exactly what that control was worth. The route from the Spice Islands to a kitchen in Paris involved a chain of intermediaries so long it functioned less like a trade route and more like a series of toll booths, each one extracting a cut before passing the goods to the next buyer. Indian merchants loaded spices onto ships at Calicut. Arab traders bought them and carried them across the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea. Those goods travelled overland through the Middle East, passing through the hands of Ottoman merchants who taxed every load. They arrived eventually in the eastern Mediterranean, where Venetian ships were waiting. And Venice, at the height of its power in the 14th and 15th centuries, controlled what happened next. If you wanted spices in Europe, and you did, because you needed them to preserve food through winter, to make medicine, to demonstrate wealth at your table, you bought them from Venice. Venice set the price. Venice decided who got supply and who didn't. Venice had cornered a market for goods that every government on the continent required, and it was making an almost incomprehensible amount of money in the process. Pepper that cost 1 denarius per pound at the source in India was selling in medieval Europe for the equivalent of 15 to 20 times that price by the time it crossed a Venetian merchant's counter. A pound of nutmeg cost the equivalent of several weeks of wages for a skilled craftsman. A pound of saffron cost more than a horse. Think about that scale for a moment. The same ingredient you might buy today for a few dollars a jar was once a financial instrument serious enough to be used as collateral on loans, as payment of dowries, and as direct tribute from conquered territories to their rulers. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 1340s, physicians prescribed burning cloves and other aromatics to purify the air. Wealthy families spent fortunes on them. The plague killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population, and spices were so essential to the medical response that their price spiked even as the economic activity generating money to buy them collapsed. Demand didn't drop during catastrophe. It surged. Here's where most accounts of spice history make a mistake. They frame the age of discovery, the Portuguese voyages down the African coast, Columbus's westward crossing, Magellan's circumnavigation, as the story of bold explorers driven by curiosity and ambition. That narrative is tidier. It makes for better statues. The actual record is less romantic. Portugal in the mid-15th century was a small country on the Atlantic edge of Europe, geographically and economically marginal, with limited access to the established Mediterranean trade routes that Venice and Genoa had spent centuries locking up. When the Ottoman Empire completed its conquest of Constantinople in 1453 and tightened control over the overland routes connecting Asia to the Mediterranean, the situation became urgent. Prices for spices in Lisbon and Seville spiked. Supply became unreliable. The chokehold was tightening. The Portuguese crown understood with perfect clarity that whoever found a direct sea route to the spice-producing regions of Asia, bypassing the Arab middlemen, bypassing the Ottoman bottleneck, bypassing Venice entirely, would not just compete in the spice trade. They would own it. Prince Henry of Portugal, known to posterity as Henry the Navigator, despite never personally sailing on any of his sponsored expeditions, funded systematic exploration of the African coast starting in the 1420s. The goal was always the same: find the southern tip of Africa, round it and reach India by sea. Every voyage that came back with new charts and new knowledge pushed the known boundary a little further south. It took decades. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope and proved it could be done. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the circuit, a 24,000-mile round trip from Lisbon to Calicut and back, and returned with enough spices that the cargo paid for the entire expedition 60 times over. 60 times. The Portuguese didn't sail to Asia looking for adventure. They were looking for a monopoly, and once they found the route, they moved with brutal efficiency to establish one. They built fortified trading posts along the African coast, in the Persian Gulf, in India, in Southeast Asia. They used naval firepower to force local rulers into exclusive treaties. They sank Arab trading vessels when negotiation failed. They were not traders who happened to carry weapons. They were an armed commercial operation. Within 20 years of da Gama's first voyage, Portugal had effectively seized control of the Indian Ocean spice trade. Meanwhile, Spain had bet on a different route. Columbus, sailing west in 1492 under Spanish sponsorship, was working from a calculation that Asia could be reached faster by crossing the Atlantic than by going around Africa. The calculation was wrong. He significantly underestimated the circumference of the Earth, but the logic was sound. If Portugal was going to lock up the eastern route, Spain needed a western one. He found something else entirely. The Caribbean islands Columbus reached produced none of the spices he was looking for. He brought back allspice, which was not what his employers had contracted for. He brought back chili peppers, which were interesting but not profitable. He brought back tobacco and rubber whose commercial potential wouldn't be understood for decades. He died still convinced he had reached the outer islands of Asia, never having processed that the landmass he'd encountered was something that no European cartographer had imagined. The irony is worth sitting with. The entire Western Hemisphere, its civilizations, its resources, its subsequent history of colonization and catastrophe, entered the awareness of Europe as a navigational error made by a man looking for pepper. What happened after the Portuguese established their sea route reshaped the economic geography of Europe within a generation. Venice, which had spent 200 years as the dominant power in Mediterranean trade, didn't collapse immediately. But the structural advantage that had made the city wealthy, its position as the necessary middleman between Asia and Europe, began eroding the moment a ship could sail from Lisbon directly to Calicut. Venetian merchants watched spice prices in Lisbon drop below their own purchase costs. The wealth that had built the palaces along the Grand Canal, that had funded the art and architecture that still draws millions of tourists every year, had been built on a geographical chokehold. When the chokehold loosened, the flow of money began moving west. Lisbon, then Seville, then Antwerp, then Amsterdam, the center of European commercial gravity shifted, port by port, over the 16th century, following the spice routes. Amsterdam's rise to become the commercial capital of the 17th century was inseparable from the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, which was essentially a state-backed corporation created specifically to compete with Portugal for control of the spice trade. The VOC established what amounted to a terrorist campaign to monopolize nutmeg and cloves, massacring populations on the Banda Islands, burning clove trees on any island that tried to trade with competitors, maintaining control through a combination of violence and economic strangulation that kept the supply artificially scarce and the price reliably high. This was not capitalism as we tend to imagine it. It was closer to a protection racket operating at the scale of an archipelago. The VOC became the most valuable company in history. Its peak market capitalization, adjusted for inflation, has been estimated at somewhere between $7 and $8 trillion in modern terms. More than Apple, more than Amazon, more than any company that exists today, built on nutmeg and cloves. There's something you might be wondering sitting where you are right now. If spices were worth this much, worth circumnavigating the globe for, worth massacre and monopoly and centuries of war, why does a jar of black pepper cost $3 at a grocery store? The same answer that explains what happened to salt explains what happened to spices. Technology broke the monopoly. In the late 18th century, the French managed to smuggle clove seedlings out of Dutch-controlled territory and begin cultivating them in Mauritius, Réunion, and eventually Zanzibar. The Dutch monopoly on cloves depended entirely on controlling the small number of islands where the trees grew. Once the trees grew somewhere else, the monopoly evaporated. The British East India Company established pepper cultivation in Penang. Coffee cultivation spread from Ethiopia to Brazil. Cinnamon, once so tightly controlled by the Dutch in Ceylon that they burned excess stock to keep prices stable, began growing in Java, in India, across the Caribbean. Every time cultivation spread beyond the original source, the price dropped, and the drop, when it came, was not gentle. The nutmeg that had justified massacres on the Banda Islands fell to a fraction of its former value within decades of cultivation spreading. The clove trade that had made the VOC the most valuable commercial enterprise in history became, by the 19th century, an ordinary commodity market. The geography that had created the monopoly was the only thing sustaining it. Once the plants moved, the power moved with them. The world we live in is the direct product of this. The borders of countries that have nothing to do with spices were drawn by people chasing them. Brazil is Portuguese-speaking because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 to divide the globe's undiscovered territories between Portugal and Spain, a negotiation triggered entirely by competition for the Asian spice route. The United States exists in its current form partly because British colonial investment in North America was funded by profits from the broader Atlantic trade system the spice routes created. The Indonesian archipelago was unified under Dutch colonial administration, specifically to manage spice production, a political structure whose consequences shaped the country's formation after independence in 1945. The language you're watching this in, the country you're watching it from, the economic system you participate in every day, these things have roots that run directly back through the spice trade, through the Age of Discovery, through the desperation of a small country on the Atlantic edge of Europe trying to find a way around a monopoly it couldn't afford. And the thing that started all of it, the actual reason any of this happened, is sitting in your spice rack right now, inert and cheap and utterly unremarkable. That gap between what pepper once was, the thing worth circumnavigating the world for, worth massacre and empire and the accidental discovery of 2 continents, and what it is now, tells you something specific about how power actually works. Power doesn't live in the resource, it lives in the control of access to the resource. Rome needed pepper and had no way to get it except through the hands of merchants who knew that. Portugal needed to break that dependence badly enough to fund 70 years of methodical coastal exploration. The Dutch needed to protect the route they'd found badly enough to commit atrocities on islands most Europeans couldn't have located on a map. The moment access democratizes, the power dissolves. The resource stays exactly what it was. The world around it transforms completely. We're watching this happen in real time with other resources right now. The strategic logic hasn't changed. The desperation of governments facing a chokehold on something they need hasn't changed. What changes is always technology. The thing that without warning makes the scarce abundant and leaves the empires built on scarcity with nothing left to defend. Columbus got the route wrong and found the wrong continent. The Portuguese got the route right and built an empire that lasted centuries. The Dutch refined the model and created the template for the modern corporation. All of them were looking for pepper. That's worth one more second of thought the next time you reach for the grinder. If this one landed, save it. You'll want the framework when we get into the history of sugar, which follows the same monopoly logic and ends considerably worse for considerably more people. That one's coming next. Drop in the comments which commodity you think shaped history more, spices or sugar, and whether you think we're currently living inside a monopoly like this one without recognizing it yet.